Today, we're going to cover a story of how something almost stole Christmas, but it was not the Grinch. Somewhere, bordered by the Indian Ocean, lies a territory so filled with strange and exotic creatures, it is a wonder to some and a scary nightmare to others. It's a continent that has baffled many people regarding how many unique species are there. The spiders grow in proportions that dwarf dogs. What about poisonous and painful bluebottles on beaches? Jellyfish, to put it in context. We're talking about an island that has a unique species that would put Muhammad Ali to shame in the ring, the kangaroo. Australia is that continent. As scary as the place sounds, someone tried to steal their Christmas. And it wasn't the Grinch, rather a tiny little yellow insect. Somewhere in Australia lies an astonishing place with an exotic rainforest, humid air, beautiful water, and ants. Yes, this picturesque beauty is known for one beautiful insect that has made the island its personal playground, the yellow crazy ant, Anoplolepsis gracilipes. The red crabs, Gecarcoidea natalis, are a native species of Christmas Island, a lovely wonder to see, and have an incredible migration habit annually. In fact, their migration is so much of a wonder and tradition that locals look forward to it yearly, sometimes closing roads to accommodate the majestic move of these regal red crabs. Every year, millions of red crabs would leave their burrows on the island and migrate to the ocean, a spectacle to see. To those outside, it's a wonder how these crabs know the way from their burrows to the sea, but for the crabs, it's instinctive. It's simply a migration they have to do. Now, for the past centuries, this mini zootopia was untouched pure nature until humans started traveling and bringing species that were not native to the island. On a cargo ship in the 20th century were some tiny ants that would change the trajectory of the island some years later. The yellow crazy ants had come to Christmas Island, and they were going to make sure they took it for themselves. Initially, nobody knew anything about these ants in Australia. They were unnoticed, but that did not change their aggressive and domineering nature on nature. Slowly and steadily, these ants would grow to show Australia why they had crazy in their name. Fast forward to some years later, and locals began to notice that the population of the red crabs during their march across the island had been dwindling. Furthermore, they began to notice a couple of dead crabs in their tracks, some dried up, some fresh, but all dead, as though some invasion had occurred that was wiping these crabs away. By the time the scientists began to take note of this occurrence, the yellow crazy ants had established themselves in a vast underground empire. You see, on the surface, these ants could raid for miles looking for food on trees and the ground. Underground, however, there were vast networks of burrows that extended to areas where they foraged. In fact, it was estimated that wherever the ants could be found on the surface, a similarly large number of ants, or more, could be found underneath the ground. So whenever the majestic crabs would walk on the surface of the ground, the ants came up to attack what they now deemed their territory. It was an onslaught for anything that moved over their land. The ants were laced with painful mandibles that had formic acid in them. They would blind the crabs and proceed to tear them apart limb from limb in some cases. The impact was so strong that for some areas the red crabs had completely disappeared. By the wake of the 21st century, scientists knew that something drastic had to be done to save the natural ecology of their Christmas island. In truth, while the ants attacked the crabs, they also attacked other creatures. The crabs were the final pointer to something disastrous occurring. The soil was being affected, native plants and species were beginning to disappear from their natural habitats, and it was spelling doom. Researchers began looking for chemical and physical controls against these ants, but for supercolonies that spread kilometers underground, it was not so effective. Finally, an idea came about. What if we found what nature had designed to deal with these monsters? Deep in South America, scientists studied a natural predator of the yellow crazy ants, a tiny parasitic wasp belonging to the genus Parasitoideae. The wasp didn't kill ants by brute force, but by terror. It hovered over ant trails, waiting for a chance to strike. Then, with surgical precision, it would inject an egg into the body of a worker ant. The larva hatched inside, eating the ant alive from within. Eventually, the wasp burst from the corpse, a new generation of killers ready to repeat the cycle. It was gruesome, it was efficient, and on paper it could work. If the parasitoid wasp could be safely introduced to Christmas Island, it might bring the yellow crazy ants under control, not by eradicating them, but by reinstating fear and natural balance. Still, the idea carried immense risk. Introducing a new species to control another had a long and controversial history. Cane toads in Australia, mongooses in Hawaii, rabbits in New Zealand, each a cautionary tale of ecological disaster. But the Christmas Island crisis was dire. Red crabs were vanishing, native birds were at risk, and the ants showed no sign of slowing down. After careful trials and consultations, the plans moved forward. Scientists prepared to release thousands of the ant-killing wasps into targeted zones across the island. The locals called them the ant assassins. What happened next would shock even the experts. The release day came quietly. There were no explosions, no smoke, no roaring machines, just scientists walking through the humid air of Christmas Island's rainforest, carrying small containers filled with life barely visible to the naked eye. Inside were the ant killers, the parasitoid wasps that had been bred under strict conditions. They were tiny, fragile, and yet the fate of an entire island rested on their wings. Each container was opened carefully in regions where the ants had formed supercolonies. The aim was to target regions where the ants had made themselves so at home it was as though the heart of the soil was beating. The wasps were released, and then immediately after, nothing happened. But within hours, the first signs began to appear. The ants' behavior shifted. The once organized, militant trails that ran through the jungle began to fragment. Workers who had moved in straight lines now twitched nervously, scattering in disarray. Some ants dropped their food, abandoning their coordinated structure altogether. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like confusion, but to scientists, it was the first signal that the parasitoid wasps had made contact. The wasps were doing something remarkable, not through brute force, but through psychological warfare. You see, yellow crazy ants have an instinctive fear of the parasitoid wasp. In their native range in South America, ants instantly recognize the wasp's shadow or wing beat. They know that if a wasp hovers above, it's not curiosity, but death. The wasp deals with ants by injecting them with eggs. In a matter of days, these eggs would have hatched, and the larvae would have eaten the ants from within. Such a death was not a nice one. Therefore, whenever the ants saw these wasps, they went into a frenzy. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Workers stopped foraging. Some even turned on each other. The ants' supercolony coordination, that same coordination that made them an unstoppable force, was now in disarray. Researchers described it as watching a mind unravel. For the first few weeks, things were quiet. However, colonies that once stretched for kilometers started to shrink. In the rainforest, the silence that had once been filled with the acid hiss of ants began to change. The crunch of red crab claws was heard again, faintly, then increasingly. The red crabs were coming back. In areas where the parasitoid wasps were released, crab populations began to stabilize. Egg clutches that would have been wiped out by ant attacks now survived. Tiny crab juveniles, once blinded by acid, began making it to the forest floor. It was a fragile, early sign, but it meant hope. Still, not everyone was celebrating. Critics called the experiment reckless. Some environmentalists warned that Australia was playing God again, risking another ecological spiral like the infamous cane toad disaster decades earlier. Others questioned whether introducing a parasitic wasp could trigger unintended consequences for native insects. The scientists behind the project pushed back. The parasitoid wasp, they explained, was not a foreign invader, it was species-specific. It only targeted yellow crazy ants, not native species. Extensive testing in controlled environments confirmed this before a single wasp was released. After the experiment was fully set in motion, the results became shocking. The ants began to outright disappear. It was like watching a magic trick unfold. For the first time in decades, scientists could walk through parts of Christmas Island without stepping on ant mounds. The forest was breathing again. Ferns grew taller, insects returned, and the birds, long silent, began to sing once more. But like all things in nature, balance came with complexity. The wasps themselves began to fade from sight after their work was done. Without dense ant populations to sustain them, they dwindled naturally. It was almost poetic, the perfect predator disappearing after fulfilling its purpose. The success of the ant killer program drew global attention. Conservationists from other countries facing invasive species problems, places like Hawaii, parts of Africa, and Southeast Asia started reaching out to study the Christmas Island model. Was this the future of biological control? Could humanity finally learn to fight invasions without creating new ones? By the second year of the release, the red crabs' migration was visibly improving. Roads, once closed due to empty trails, were again filled with millions of marching crabs, an awe-inspiring sight thought lost forever. Locals described it as watching the island heal itself. The scent of wet leaves returned. The sound of the sea mixed again with the scraping of claws. In reality, it was like watching the island finally begin to breathe a sigh of relief from the long deadlock that the ants had held them in. From the crabs that initially took the hit, to even the worms and microbes in the soil, everything finally had a chance to breathe again. And breathe they did. For a brief moment, it felt like the island had won. Yet beneath the surface, questions remained. Would the yellow crazy ants stay gone forever? Could the parasitoid wasps survive long enough to suppress any resurgence? Was this equilibrium permanent or just a pause in an endless ecological tug-of-war? The scientists didn't have the answers yet, but they had learned something deeper, that nature, when guided carefully, can sometimes find a way back to balance. Still, they knew that balance is never final. As history has shown, every time humanity meddles with nature, even with the best intentions, something always stirs in return. And on Christmas Island, something was stirring again. The soil was responding. Leaves that once piled the floors during the ant season slowly started dissipating at a faster rate. What did this mean? The microbes in the soil and its worms were back in place and doing their jobs again. Satellite images began showing something remarkable. Patches of green were expanding across the island. Areas once stripped bare by ant acid raids now had new undergrowth. Shrubs were reclaiming ground and moisture levels were stabilizing. But nature never restores itself in silence. It roars, it wrestles, it adjusts. And so the rebalancing had its complications too. The first warning signs came from bird researchers. Certain seabird species that fed on the ants' leftovers, the small crustaceans and insects displaced by the invasion, were now facing a food gap. Without the ant chaos creating easy meals, their numbers dipped slightly. On the other hand, the island's endemic thrush and the emerald dove, both driven to near extinction by ant attacks on their chicks, were making an unexpected comeback. It was a tug-of-war of survival, one group's loss, another's rebirth. In the research logs, scientists began to describe the island as in negotiation with itself. For every gain, there was a small loss, but compared to what had been lost under the reign of the yellow crazy ants, these were acceptable adjustments, nature redistributing its weight, one species at a time. And then there was the question of the ants themselves. Had they truly vanished? For a while, it looked that way, but about a year after the release, researchers noticed faint, patchy trails of yellow crazy ants reappearing in isolated zones. These weren't the massive supercolonies that once marched over the crabs. They were smaller, fragmented clusters, weak and disorganized. The parasitoid wasps still patrolled the air, swooping down whenever ant densities increased, keeping their population in check. It was, in a way, the perfect balance. The wasps weren't eradicating the ants completely, they were simply controlling them like a natural governor in an engine. Too many ants, and the wasps appeared. Too few, and the wasps starved. The ecosystem found its own rhythm again. Still, every success story comes with its skeptics. Some scientists argued that the improvement wasn't just because of the wasps. In truth, the success of having Christmas Island returned to the way it was enough of a relief for people. The forest canopy was closing up again. The sound of cicadas filled the evenings. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. Then came an unexpected twist. A researcher who had been tracking parasitoid wasp activity noticed something odd in her trap logs. The wasps were moving farther inland than usual, away from the known ant zones. It was a minor observation at first, but one that raised questions. What were they following? Were the ants moving again, or were the wasps adapting to a new diet? It triggered an island-wide investigation. Samples were collected, traps set, and after weeks of monitoring, the answer came. The wasps weren't shifting prey. They were simply chasing micro-colonies, small clusters of yellow crazy ants trying to regroup deep in the forest. It was a beautiful symphony to behold, the perfect balance that was needed. Nature's chessboard was alive and well. The wasps had learned the scent, the rhythm, the movement of their target so deeply that they followed it anywhere it went. This wasn't artificial control anymore, it was instinct. The system was self-sustaining. For the scientific team, this was a breakthrough, proof that the parasitoid wasps could maintain long-term population checks without further intervention. For the islanders, it was reassurance that the nightmare of the ant invasion might truly be behind them. But for a few biologists, it raised an unsettling question. If a small, controlled change could ripple through the ecosystem effectively, what would happen if something else, equally small, was introduced by accident? After all, balance is delicate, and the same system that now protects Christmas Island could, under the wrong conditions, be its undoing. The Christmas Island story taught scientists a lot, one thing being that balancing nature was a humbling experience. This is why the successful balance brought back to Christmas Island was a much celebrated victory. The scientists knew this better than anyone. It was not just about ants or wasps or crabs, but about what happens when humans decide to intervene in nature's wars. When the yellow crazy ants arrived on Christmas Island, they weren't evil. They were simply out of place. Travelers on human ships, hitchhikers in cargo, passengers on our global trade routes. They did what species do best, survive. And in the process, they broke the balance of a world that wasn't theirs. The ripple effect of Christmas Island's success wasn't just ecological, it was philosophical. It changed how conservationists thought about control. Instead of fighting invasions with chemicals or culls, they began to ask, what if nature already has the tools to heal itself? What if the best way to fix the problem is to listen to the system we broke? But even amid the praise, the scientists behind the project stayed cautious because they knew one successful case didn't mean universal safety. The difference was precision. The parasitoid wasps were hyper-specialized, locked evolutionary onto the yellow crazy ants. They couldn't switch targets even if they wanted to. The red crabs of Christmas Island still march every year now, carpeting the island in a river of life that can be seen from space. The locals call it a second dawn. In a way, scientists did not save the island. They gave it a chance to save itself. The forest thrives, the birds sing again, and under the canopy the red crabs march, living proof that sometimes all nature needs is a little help finding its rhythm again. But the most haunting question remains, could this balance last? Realistically, we can only watch and see. Still, there's hope. Because the Christmas Island experiment didn't just save one place, it changed how humanity sees itself in the story of life. Furthermore, the island showed us that we did not rule this planet. We merely participated in its dealings. Many times we were the disruptors of what was naturally in place. In some instances, however, we were the planet's healers. All in all, we were part of its ecosystem and had a significant part to play in that ecosystem functioning well. Looking back at the story of Christmas Island, the disruption began when humans began trading between continents, bringing species from their natural habitats to alien places. While the yellow, crazy ants thrived in Christmas Island, they were left without their natural predators or a system to balance their existence. The same humans who participated in bringing these disruptions were the ones to look for tenable solutions for the island. From chemical warfare to biological warfare, we looked to restore the balance that was fast being lost. Like the island's tradition of watching the crabs migrate, so is there the tradition of seeing gifts under the Christmas tree on Christmas morning. And the same way the Grinch couldn't steal Christmas, we didn't let the yellow crazy ants steal the Christmas Island tradition. It is a bit ironic, as usual, that humans would tamper with ecosystems only to work tirelessly to undo their harm. But the deeper you look into the Christmas Island saga, the more it stops being a story about ants and crabs and becomes a story about us, Every ecological disruption humanity has ever caused sits on the same knife edge between disaster and discovery, and Christmas Island offered a rare glimpse of what happens when we choose discovery instead of defeat. Scientists began noticing something unexpected in the months after the ecosystem started stabilizing. The forest wasn't just healing, it was responding with surprising creativity. Species interactions that hadn't been observed in decades reappeared. Nocturnal insects returned to pollinate plants that had gone dormant. Even the island's famous robber crabs began shifting their behavior, venturing into areas they had abandoned during the ant rain. Ecologists started calling the phenomenon a rewilding pulse, a sudden surge of ecological creativity triggered when an invasive pressure lifts. It was as though the island had been holding its breath for years, and the moment it exhaled, every living thing sprinted to claim its place again. This wasn't a restoration, this was a resurgence. And that resurgence carried clues that scientists had never expected. Microbial samples from rejuvenated soil showed increased fungal richness and nutrient cycling rates far beyond baseline levels. Researchers are now studying whether prolonged ant domination created a kind of ecological backlog energy stored in roots, dormant spores, and suppressed populations waiting for their moment. If true, Christmas Island may rewrite entire textbooks on how ecosystems rebound after collapse. But perhaps the most intriguing discovery came from the crabs themselves. Biologists tracking their migrations noticed subtle changes in route choice and timing. Freed from ant attacks, the crabs began exploring new corridors through the forest, reopening ancient trails long since abandoned. Some routes even aligned with old lore passed down by island elders, pathways believed to have been used generations ago before the ants ever arrived. It hinted at a memory older than the invasion, a biological rhythm the island had never completely forgotten. And in that moment, the Christmas Island story stopped being a tale of destruction or recovery. It became something far more profound, proof that nature, when given even a sliver of opportunity, doesn't just heal, it innovates, it adapts, it remembers.